My name is Roland Pierce. I'm 68 years old, and 3 weeks after my son called me pathetic in front of his friends, he sat across a leasing office table signing a rental agreement for an apartment he had no idea I actually owned. The property management company handling the paperwork under a business name that kept my own name quietly out of the transaction until the exact moment it mattered most. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway. If you've ever been dismissed by someone you love, based entirely on a picture of your life that was never actually complete, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened in that leasing office. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 36 years working as a maintenance supervisor for a large apartment management company, unglamorous work that kept my hands rough and my hours long, fixing plumbing and electrical issues across a portfolio of properties I never once imagined. In my younger years, I might someday own pieces of myself. My wife Sandra passed 7 years ago, and in the years since, I've lived a genuinely modest life in a small 2-bedroom apartment, driving a 14-year-old sedan, wearing the same handful of plain shirts in rotation, the kind of unremarkable daily existence that, on its surface, tells almost nobody anything meaningful about what actually sits underneath it. Here's the thing about me that my son Derek has never fully understood. Even though the evidence of it exists in property records he could have looked up at any point over the past decade. Over the course of my career, working alongside property owners and investors as part of my maintenance role, I learned the actual mechanics of real estate investment in a way most maintenance workers never bother to absorb. And starting about 18 years ago, using careful savings and a series of increasingly ambitious but always conservative decisions, I began quietly acquiring small residential properties myself, starting with a single duplex and gradually building, over nearly 2 decades, a portfolio of 11 rental properties spread across 3 neighborhoods, managed through a property management company I established specifically to keep my own name at a professional distance from the day-to-day tenant relationships. I never made a show of any of it. Sandra knew the full scope and supported the whole endeavor quietly alongside me, but we agreed, early on, that we wanted Derek to grow up without measuring his own ambitions against a father's growing portfolio, wanting him to build his own path without either leaning on an assumed inheritance or feeling pressured to match some standard he hadn't chosen for himself. Derek grew up knowing, vaguely, that his father worked in apartment maintenance, a description that was true as far as it went, but that left out entirely the ownership structure quietly accumulating alongside that maintenance career. Derek is 31 now, working in sales for a technology company, sharing an apartment with 2 roommates in an arrangement that had grown increasingly strained over the past year, prompting him to search for his own place for the first time in his adult life. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Derek is fundamentally a cruel person. But over the years since Sandra passed, I noticed a specific pattern developing in how he discussed my life with his friends. A pattern that eventually culminated in the exact comment that set everything else in motion. There was a birthday dinner about 2 years ago when one of Derek's girlfriends at the time asked about my career, and Derek answered, somewhat dismissively, "My dad fixes stuff at apartment buildings, has for like 40 years, never really moved up from that." A description accurate on its surface, but delivered with a specific tone that positioned my career as a lack of ambition rather than a deliberate, patient path towards something Derek simply didn't know existed. There was a family gathering the following year when my brother mentioned, in passing, something about real estate investment trends, and Derek said, laughing lightly, "Dad wouldn't know the first thing about that stuff. He spent his whole life fixing other people's toilets. Not exactly an investment guru," a comment that landed harder than Derek likely intended, given how completely inaccurate it actually was. There was a holiday dinner, about a year before the party incident, when Derek's roommate at the time asked me directly what my retirement plans looked like, genuinely curious rather than dismissive, and Derek answered for me, quickly, "Dad's pretty set in his ways. Honestly, I don't think retirement's really something he's planned for financially. He's more of a live day-to-day kind of guy. A description that couldn't have been further from the actual, carefully structured retirement and estate planning I'd built alongside the property portfolio over the previous decade. There was an afternoon, about 8 months ago, when I overheard Derek on the phone with a friend, through the thin walls of my own apartment during a visit, describing me as a sweet guy, but honestly kind of a sad case, lives alone in this tiny apartment, drives this ancient car, never really did anything with his life beyond the maintenance job. I stood in my own kitchen for a good 10 seconds, listening to my son describe 18 years of careful property investment, a portfolio worth well over $3 million at that point, as a life that never amounted to anything, and then I continued making coffee, saying nothing about what I'd heard. He never knew I'd heard a word. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Derek in the way people are angry at strangers. Derek loved me, genuinely, in the specific, distracted way of a young man who had absorbed, over years, a narrow understanding of his father, built entirely on surface details. An apartment, a car, a maintenance job, without ever once thinking to ask real questions about what those surface details might not be telling the whole story of. The specific incident that set everything in motion happened 3 weeks before that leasing office signature, at a gathering Derek hosted at his current apartment, several of his friends present, myself included, having been invited, I suspect, mostly out of obligation rather than genuine desire for my company. I arrived in my usual plain clothes, driving my usual old sedan, and spent the evening mostly on the periphery of conversations that revolved around topics I wasn't naturally part of, careers and investments, and the ordinary social currency of people in their 30s building visibly ambitious lives. At one point, a friend of Derek's, a young man named Trevor who worked in commercial real estate, mentioned, with genuine interest, that he'd recently been discussing investment property strategies with his own father, and asked, politely, whether my maintenance background had ever given me any interest in real estate investment myself. "My dad?" Derek said, laughing before I could answer, loud enough that several nearby conversations paused to listen. "No offense, Dad, but you've spent 40 years fixing other people's properties. Not exactly the profile of someone building an empire. I love you, but let's be honest. You're kind of pathetic when it comes to that stuff. Some people just aren't cut out for that level of ambition, and that's fine, but let's not pretend otherwise." The room laughed, lightly, the particular laugh of people who don't fully register the weight of what's just been said because the tone was casual rather than cruel. I want to be honest about what that specific word, pathetic, did to me. Standing in my son's living room, having spent nearly 2 decades quietly building something he apparently believed I was fundamentally incapable of. I didn't correct him. I finished my drink, made polite conversation for another 20 minutes, and left earlier than I'd originally planned, driving home in my old sedan carrying a particular kind of quiet I didn't fully examine until I was sitting alone in my own modest apartment an hour later. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something, watching at home right now. Have you ever been described, casually, in front of people whose opinion mattered to the person doing the describing, as fundamentally incapable of something you'd actually already achieved? How did you carry that, knowing the truth but choosing not to correct the record in the moment? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 3 weeks later is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. 3 weeks after that gathering, Derek called to share some genuinely good news, having finally decided to move out of his strained roommate situation and secure his own apartment, a unit he'd found through a listing service, in a well-maintained complex in a neighborhood he described as actually really solid, great location, reasonable rent for the area. He mentioned the property management company handling the lease, a name I recognized immediately as one of the 2 management companies I use to oversee my own portfolio, though the specific complex he named wasn't one I immediately placed among my 11 properties without checking my records. I checked those records that same evening and found, with a specific, quiet irony I genuinely hadn't anticipated, that the exact unit Derek had selected was in a building I'd acquired 4 years earlier, one of my more recent purchases. Managed day-to-day by my property management company, under its business name, Pierce Property Group, a name Derek had apparently encountered on the paperwork without ever connecting it to me directly, given that I'd always simply been Dad, rather than any formal title associated with the business. I want to describe what happened at that leasing office signing, because it's the moment everything changed, and it happened almost entirely by accident. A scheduling overlap I hadn't planned but didn't avoid once I realized it was approaching. I occasionally visit my property management office in person, reviewing quarterly reports with my property manager, a capable woman named Carol, who has run the day-to-day operations of Pierce Property Group for nearly a decade. On the specific afternoon Derek had scheduled his lease signing, I happened to be at that same office reviewing paperwork with Carol in a back conference room, when Carol mentioned, in passing, that she had a new tenant signing shortly, someone named Derek Pierce. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me hearing my own son's name mentioned in that context, because I think it matters. Something that had been quiet for 3 weeks, since that living room comment, opened its eyes with a kind of tired, unexpected clarity. The specific stillness of a man realizing an accidental collision was about to reveal something his son had never once bothered to investigate. "Carol," I said, "I think I might actually know that particular tenant. Would you mind if I sat in on this signing, just briefly?" Carol, who has known me long enough to trust my judgment on these things without much explanation, agreed readily, and I found myself sitting quietly in the corner of the leasing office when Derek arrived, 10 minutes later, carrying a folder of his own paperwork, genuinely surprised to see me there. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, keeping my voice level, watching the confusion on his face deepen as he tried to work out the coincidence. Carol, ever professional, began walking Derek through the lease documents, and I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because it's the actual heart of this story, more than the comment at the party or the coincidence of the leasing office itself. "Just so you're aware," Carol said to Derek, midway through reviewing the ownership disclosure section required by state law, "this property is owned by Pierce Property Group, which is owned entirely by Roland Pierce, who's sitting right there actually. I assume you two are related, given the shared last name?" Derek's face went through several rapid transformations: confusion, then a dawning, disbelieving recognition, then something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine shock as the pieces assembled themselves in real time. "Dad," he said slowly, "you own this building?" "I do," I said, "along with 10 others as it happens." "10 others," he repeated, his voice considerably smaller now than it had been 3 weeks earlier in his own living room. "Dad, at Trevor's. I mean, at my apartment. When I said that thing about you being pathetic with investments, about not being cut out for that level of ambition, I had no idea any of this existed." "I know," I said. "That's rather the point I've been sitting with since you said it." Carol, sensing the personal weight the conversation had suddenly taken on, offered to give us a few minutes alone in the conference room, gathering her paperwork and stepping out with the particular tact of someone who's navigated plenty of unexpected family moments in her decade running the office. "How long have you actually been doing this?" Derek asked, once we were alone, his voice still carrying the specific disorientation of someone recalibrating an entire understanding in real time. 18 years, I said. "Started with a single duplex, back when you were still in middle school. Your mother knew the whole time. We agreed early on that we wanted you building your own path, without either leaning on an assumed inheritance or feeling pressured to match a standard you hadn't chosen yourself." 18 years, he repeated quietly. "I've been calling you pathetic for building something for 18 years that I genuinely had no idea existed." The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the leasing office is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve. And I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Derek calling me the following day, his voice unsteady in a way I hadn't heard from him in years, asking if we could talk properly about what had happened. "Dad," he said, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table, "I need to actually understand how I got this so wrong. 18 years, you said? 11 properties? How did I not know any of this? Because your mother and I decided, a long time ago, that we wanted you building your own path without either leaning on an assumed inheritance or measuring yourself against a portfolio you hadn't earned yourself, I said. That decision made sense at the time. I'm not certain anymore it was entirely the right one, given what it apparently allowed you to believe about me in the meantime. I called you pathetic, Derek said quietly. In front of Trevor, in front of everyone. I need you to know I've been sick about it since Carol said your name in that office. Not because of the money, Dad, though obviously that's part of the shock. Because I said something genuinely cruel about my own father's ambition, based on nothing but a maintenance job and an old car, and I didn't even bother to ask a single real question before deciding I understood the whole picture. That's an honest thing to say, I told him. I'd rather have that than a comfortable excuse. Let me pause again for just a moment, because I think this next part matters considerably. I want to be honest that hearing Derek's genuine distress didn't erase what he'd said in that living room. I didn't rush to reassure him that it was fine, that words said casually among friends don't actually carry weight. Derek, I said, I need you to understand something before we go any further. I'm not upset because my ego needed the validation of you finding out about the properties. I built that portfolio for its own sake, patiently, because the work itself mattered to me, not because I was waiting for a moment to prove you wrong. What actually concerns me is that you felt comfortable enough, in front of your friends, calling me pathetic based on almost nothing, and that comfort came from somewhere, some assumption you'd built about my worth that had nothing to do with actually knowing me. You're right, he said. I think I built an entire understanding of you around the most visible surface-level details. The apartment, the car, the maintenance job, and I never once thought to ask what might be underneath those details, because I'd already decided, somewhere along the way, that there probably wasn't anything else to find. There was an afternoon, about a month after that leasing office moment, when Derek asked if he could actually see the full scope of the property portfolio, not just hear about it in the abstract, but walk through the properties themselves, understand the actual mechanics of how I'd built it over nearly 2 decades. I spent an entire Saturday walking him through 4 of the properties, explaining specific decisions, specific risks I'd taken, and specific ones I'd deliberately avoided. The patient, unglamorous discipline that had actually built the whole thing, one modest acquisition at a time. I think I assumed building something like this required some kind of visible, flashy ambition, he said, standing in the parking lot of one of my earlier acquisitions, a modest fourplex I'd purchased 12 years earlier. I never considered that it could look like this instead, quiet and patient and completely invisible unless someone actually bothered to look. I watched my son, in the weeks after that, do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. At a subsequent gathering with the same group of friends, when Trevor asked, genuinely curious now, about my portfolio, Derek answered before I could, with something that sounded, for the first time, like real pride rather than careful management. My dad's built an 11-property real estate portfolio over the past 18 years, all through patient, careful investment, while working a full maintenance career the entire time. I called him pathetic about this exact thing a month ago, and it's honestly one of the most embarrassing things I've ever said, because I had no idea what I was actually dismissing. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for nearly 2 decades. I thought about Sandra a great deal in those weeks, wondering what she would have made of watching our son finally reckon with an assumption he'd carried, largely unexamined, right up until an accidental scheduling overlap forced the reckoning into the open. It's been almost a year now since that leasing office signing. Derek still lives in that same apartment, paying rent through the same management company, though our relationship, both as landlord and tenant, and simply as father and son, has shifted considerably from where it stood before that afternoon. He calls regularly now, asking genuine questions about property management, about investment strategy, questions that come from actual curiosity rather than polite conversation. Last month, Derek asked if I'd be willing to walk him through the basics of starting his own small property investment, not asking for capital, but genuinely wanting to understand the process I'd built quietly over nearly 2 decades. Wanting, he said, to build something of his own, with the same patient discipline, rather than continuing to assume that kind of ambition simply wasn't available to people like us. I think about that living room comment often now, sitting in my own modest apartment some evenings, genuinely content with the quiet life I've built alongside a portfolio very few people who meet me casually would ever guess exists. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding anything deliberately, but because we've already decided, based on a handful of visible surface details, exactly what shape their life is allowed to take. Derek looked at me for years and saw a maintenance worker with an old car and a small apartment, and built an entire assessment of my worth and ambition on those details alone. He wasn't entirely wrong that I lived a modest, unremarkable-looking life. He was wrong about nearly everything else. I don't regret the years of keeping that portfolio quiet, deliberately separate from Derek's own developing sense of ambition and self-worth. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let the pathetic comment stand, even briefly, without correcting it immediately. I'd make the same choice again, in most respects, wanting Derek to build his own path without either leaning on an assumed inheritance or measuring himself against a portfolio he hadn't earned. What I've learned, watching my son genuinely reckon with the gap between his assumption and the actual reality, is that sometimes the people we love need direct, undeniable evidence before an abstract, unspoken truth about who we actually are finally has room to land. Evidence that arrives, sometimes, through circumstances neither of us could have planned or predicted. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone you love dismissed you based on an incomplete picture of your actual life, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe every quiet, unassuming person deserves to be seen for who they actually are, not just who they appear to be on the surface, hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you every single week.